Sarah sat at the mahogany table, watching the familiar theatre unfold before her. The conversation flowed like a carefully choreographed dance. Weather, vacations, the latest Netflix series everyone was binge-watching. Laughter erupted at predetermined moments. Heads nodded in synchronized approval, and the comfortable rhythm of small talk filled the air like background music. But Sarah heard something else beneath the surface symphony. She heard the tremor in Michael's voice when he mentioned his promotion, the way it betrayed his fear of failure. She noticed how Jennifer's eyes darted away when someone asked about her marriage, how her smile tightened just slightly at the corners. She felt the weight of David's silence, the way he retreated into himself whenever the conversation turned to success and ambition. The others seemed oblivious to these subtle undercurrents, content to skim across the surface of human interaction like stones skipping on water. But Sarah dove deep with every glance, every pause, every carefully chosen word. She couldn't help herself. It was as if she possessed some invisible antenna that picked up frequencies others couldn't hear. When the conversation turned to current events, Sarah felt something stir within her. Here was a chance for substance, for meaning, for the kind of dialogue that fed her soul. She leaned forward, her voice carrying the weight of genuine curiosity and concern. Isn't it fascinating how we're all so connected through technology, yet loneliness rates have never been higher? I was reading about how social media creates this paradox of connection and isolation simultaneously. It makes me wonder, are we really connecting with each other, or are we just performing connection? Sarah felt the familiar sting of rejection, the invisible force field that seemed to surround her words whenever she tried to venture beyond the surface. She smiled politely and retreated into herself, carrying the weight of her unspoken thoughts like stones in her pockets. This is the story of the deep thinker, not a fairy tale of misunderstood genius, but a raw, honest exploration of what it means to see clearly in a world that prefers the comfort of blindness. It's the story of those who cannot help but feel deeply, think critically, and question constantly in a society that rewards conformity and punishes authenticity.
Sooner you let my heart torn in two. Sooner you let my nights cold and blue. Love is fake, but none hurt like you. Rain on my soul, your shadow won't part. Rain on my soul, it drowns my heart. Sooner you love a wound that won't start. Famine wails like my tears in the dark. Steel drum sighs where you left your mark. Chicago streets cry, my world falls apart.
Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist who spent his life mapping the hidden territories of the human psyche, understood this phenomenon intimately. He wrote, "The more intelligent and self-aware a person is, the more they suffer from the general unconsciousness of society. This isn't a badge of honor, it's a warning, a recognition of the beautiful burden carried by those who cannot unsee what they have seen."
Sooner your heart breaks, my endless wheel.
The architecture of alienation. What makes a deep thinker? Is it intelligence, sensitivity, some cruel twist of fate that condemns certain individuals to a life of perpetual outsiderhood? The answer is far more complex and fascinating than you might imagine. Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher who famously declared that God is dead, understood the profound loneliness that comes with seeing through society's comfortable illusions. He wrote about the free spirit, those individuals who had broken free from the chains of conventional thinking, but now found themselves wandering in a wilderness of their own making. These free spirits, Nietzsche argued, were essential for human progress, but they paid a heavy price for their liberation. The deep thinker's journey often begins in childhood, in those formative moments when other children accept the world as it appears, while some ask the questions that make adults uncomfortable. Why do grown-ups say one thing and do another? Why do we have to pretend to be happy when we're not? Why does love sometimes feel conditional? Why do the rules seem arbitrary? These children learn quickly that their questions are unwelcome. They're told to stop overthinking, to just accept things as they are, to be more like the other kids. But the questions don't stop. They simply go underground, growing more complex and urgent with each passing year. Arthur Schopenhauer, the pessimistic philosopher who influenced both Nietzsche and Jung, observed that most people are like hedgehogs trying to keep warm in winter. They huddle together for comfort, but if they get too close, they prick each other with their spines. The deep thinker often feels like a hedgehog, with particularly sharp spines, desperate for connection, but seemingly destined to wound those who come too close. But here's what makes this phenomenon even more intriguing. Deep thinkers aren't just intellectually different, they're neurologically different. Neuroscientist Dr. Elaine Aron's research on highly sensitive people reveals that approximately 20% of the population has a more sensitive nervous system, processing information more deeply and being more aware of subtleties in their environment. These individuals, whom she calls highly sensitive persons, or HSPS, often overlap significantly with what we might call deep thinkers. The deep thinker's brain literally works differently. They notice details others miss, pick up on emotional subtleties, and process information more thoroughly. In a world that rewards quick decisions and surface-level interactions, this depth of processing can feel like a disability rather than a gift. Consider the workplace, where the deep thinker's need for meaning and authenticity crashes against corporate culture's demand for efficiency and conformity. While others can compartmentalize their values and just do the job, the deep thinker struggles with tasks that feel meaningless or ethically questionable. They're the ones who ask uncomfortable questions in meetings, who point out the elephant in the room, who refuse to participate in office gossip or corporate doublespeak. Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, understood that humans can endure almost any suffering if they can find meaning in it. But what happens when society systematically strips meaning from human experience? What happens when work becomes mere productivity, relationships become transactions, and existence becomes a series of distractions? The deep thinker feels this meaninglessness more acutely than others. They cannot simply phone it in or go through the motions. They need their lives to matter, their work to have purpose, their relationships to be authentic. In a world that often seems designed to prevent exactly these things, is it any wonder they feel alienated? The frequency of truth. Have you ever noticed how some people seem to operate on an entirely different wavelength? They speak a language that sounds like yours but carries meanings you can't quite grasp. They laugh at jokes that aren't funny, get excited about things that seem trivial, and remain unmoved by experiences that touch your soul. This isn't about intelligence or education, it's about frequency. Jung wrote extensively about the collective unconscious, that shared psychic space where humanity's deepest fears, desires, and archetypal patterns reside. He believed that most people live their entire lives without ever truly encountering their own unconscious material, content to follow scripts written by others and never questioning the fundamental assumptions that guide their existence. The deep thinker, however, has made contact with this deeper realm. They've touched something real beneath the surface of everyday consciousness. And once you've felt that authenticity, everything else feels like performance. It's like discovering color after living in a black and white world. You can't unsee the vibrancy, and you can't pretend that grayscale is enough. This creates what we might call the frequency problem. Deep thinkers vibrate at the frequency of truth, while much of society operates at the frequency of comfort. Truth is often uncomfortable, inconvenient, and disruptive. It asks us to look at things we'd rather ignore, to feel things we'd rather numb, to question things we'd rather take for granted. The Buddhist concept of Maya, the veil of illusion that obscures reality, speaks to this phenomenon. Most people live comfortably within Maya, accepting the illusion as reality, but the deep thinker has glimpsed behind the veil, and they can no longer participate in the collective pretense with the same unconscious ease. This doesn't make them superior, it makes them lonely. Imagine being the only person in a room who can see that the emperor has no clothes. Your truth-telling isn't welcomed, it's seen as disruptive, negative, or attention-seeking. You're not trying to be difficult, you're simply unable to participate in the collective denial. The ancient Greek philosopher Plato illustrated this perfectly in his famous allegory of the cave. Prisoners chained in a cave mistake shadows on the wall for reality until one breaks free and sees the world as it truly is. When he returns to share his discovery, the other prisoners reject his testimony and prefer their familiar shadows. The truth-teller becomes the outsider, the troublemaker, the one who disturbs the peace. But here's what Plato understood that many miss. The freed prisoner has a responsibility to keep trying, to keep speaking truth, even when it's unwelcome, not because he enjoys being rejected, but because truth itself has value, and someone must bear witness to it. The deep thinker carries this burden of witness. They see through the masks people wear, the systems that exploit, the beliefs that limit. They feel the collective pain that others have learned to ignore. They carry the questions that others have stopped asking, and while this can be overwhelming, it's also profoundly important.
Oh, river, hear my heart, it's breaking in the midnight rain. Please, oh river, hear my heart, it's breaking in the midnight rain. she's gone, and her shadow's carved in me, flowing with this endless aching pain. Don't let the current drown my tears. Don't let the darkness swallow my fears. Please, sweet river, carry my sorrow downstream. My soul's torn apart, crying to the river for a dream.
The emotional sponge. Picture this: you walk into a room and immediately sense that something is wrong. The conversation is light, everyone is smiling, but there's an undercurrent of tension you can almost taste. Others seem oblivious, chatting happily about weekend plans, but you feel like you're drowning in unspoken emotions. Welcome to the world of the deep thinker, where emotional boundaries are often as porous as Swiss cheese. Jung identified this phenomenon as part of what he called psychological contagion, the unconscious transmission of emotions and psychological states between individuals. While everyone experiences this to some degree, deep thinkers seem to have their emotional antennae permanently extended, picking up signals from every direction. Dr. Judith Orloff, a psychiatrist who has extensively studied empaths and sensitive individuals, describes this as being an emotional sponge. Deep thinkers don't just observe emotions, they absorb them. They feel the anxiety of the stressed colleague, the sadness of the friend going through a divorce, the anger of the stranger on the subway, and often they mistake these absorbed emotions for their own. This absorption isn't voluntary. It's not a conscious choice to take on others' emotional burdens. It's more like having a radio that can't be turned off, constantly tuning into emotional frequencies whether you want to or not. The result is exhaustion, a deep soul-level tiredness that can't be cured by sleep. But here's where it gets even more complex. Society has learned to use this sensitivity. People are drawn to deep thinkers like moths to flame. They sense, often unconsciously, that here is someone who will really listen, who will understand, who will hold space for their pain. And so the deep thinker becomes the unofficial therapist, the emotional dumping ground, the one who always has time for other people's problems. The irony is devastating. The very people who most need emotional support, who carry the weight of their own deep feelings, plus the absorbed emotions of others, are the ones everyone else turns to for comfort. It's like asking someone who's already drowning to save others from drowning. Psychologist Dr. Karen Hall writes about the concept of emotional labor, the invisible work of managing emotions, both our own and others. Deep thinkers perform enormous amounts of emotional labor, often without recognition or reciprocation. They're the ones who remember anniversaries, who check in on friends going through difficult times, who notice when someone is struggling and offer support. But when they need support themselves, they often find that others don't know how to provide it. The deep thinker's emotional needs are complex, nuanced, and often difficult to understand. They can't be fixed with platitudes or surface-level reassurances. They need to be truly seen, understood, and met at their level of depth. This creates what we might call emotional asymmetry in relationships. The deep thinker gives profoundly, but struggles to receive at the same level. They become skilled at supporting others, but often feel like they're speaking a foreign language when trying to express their own needs. The result is a particular kind of loneliness, not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being misunderstood. It's the loneliness of carrying thoughts and feelings that seem too complex or intense for others to handle. It's the loneliness of always being the strong one, the wise one, the one who has it all figured out, when inside you're often just as lost and confused as everyone else. The mask of normalcy. There's a moment in every deep thinker's life when they realize they're different. Not special, different. It usually happens gradually through a series of small rejections, confused looks, and uncomfortable silences. The realization that their natural way of being in the world is somehow wrong, too much, inappropriate. And so begins the careful construction of what we might call the mask of normalcy. This isn't conscious deception, it's survival. The deep thinker learns to modulate their voice, to choose their words carefully, to gauge the emotional temperature of every room before speaking. They become skilled at reading people not out of manipulation, but out of necessity. The mask serves multiple purposes. It protects the deep thinker from rejection and allows them to move through society with less friction. But it also protects others from the discomfort of encountering genuine depth. The mask is a kind of emotional diplomacy, a way of saying, "Don't worry, I won't make you feel things you don't want to feel." But masks are exhausting to maintain. They require constant vigilance, constant performance, constant denial of one's authentic self. The deep thinker learns to laugh at jokes they don't find funny, to express enthusiasm for things that bore them, to hide their reactions to the cruelty and superficiality they witness daily. The existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about bad faith, the ways we lie to ourselves to avoid the anxiety of authentic existence. But for the deep thinker, the mask isn't about avoiding their own authenticity. It's about making their authenticity palatable to others. They know exactly who they are. They just can't always afford to show it. This creates a split in the deep thinker's sense of self. There's the private self, complex, questioning, feeling, and the public self, agreeable, simple, safe. The energy required to maintain this split is enormous, and it leads to what psychologists call masking fatigue. The deep thinker often feels like they're living a double life, authentic in private but performative in public. The tragedy is that this masking often backfires. While it may help the deep thinker avoid some rejection, it also prevents them from forming the deep connections they crave. How can you be truly known if you're always hiding your true self? How can you find your tribe if you're constantly pretending to be someone else? Yet the alternative, dropping the mask entirely, can feel impossibly risky. The deep thinker has learned, often through painful experience, that their unfiltered self is too much for most people to handle. They've seen how their intensity can overwhelm, how their questions can threaten, how their depth can isolate. This is the deep thinker's catch-22. They need authentic connection to thrive. But their authenticity often drives people away. They need to be seen and understood, but their true self seems to make others uncomfortable. They need community, but they struggle to find others who can match their depth. The collective unconscious conspiracy. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious suggests that beneath our individual minds lies a shared psychic space containing the archetypal patterns and primordial images that shape human experience. But what happens when the collective unconscious becomes infected with fear of depth, authenticity, and genuine feeling? We live in what many psychologists and sociologists call a post-truth society. Not because truth doesn't exist, but because we've collectively decided that comfort is more important than accuracy. We've created systems that reward appearance over substance, performance over authenticity, and agreement over truth-telling. The deep thinker finds themselves in opposition to this collective agreement. They're like the child in the fairy tale who points out that the emperor has no clothes, except instead of being celebrated for their honesty, they're shushed, marginalized, or labeled as negative. Consider the modern workplace, where emotional intelligence is praised in theory but punished in practice. The deep thinker who points out toxic dynamics, who questions unethical practices, or who refuses to participate in office politics is often labeled as not a team player or difficult to work with. The very qualities that make them valuable, their integrity, their insight, their unwillingness to compromise their values, become liabilities in systems that prioritize compliance over consciousness. The educational system provides another example. From an early age, children are taught to value the right answer over the right question. They're rewarded for memorization and compliance, not for critical thinking or creative exploration. The deep thinker child who naturally questions assumptions and seeks understanding rather than just information often struggles in these environments. Social media amplifies this phenomenon by creating echo chambers where complexity is reduced to sound bites and nuance is sacrificed for virality. The deep thinker's natural inclination toward nuanced thinking and complex analysis doesn't translate well to platforms designed for quick consumption and instant gratification. But perhaps most insidiously, the collective unconscious has developed what we might call depth phobia, a fear of psychological and emotional depth. We've created a culture that medicates discomfort, distracts from pain, and pathologizes sadness. We've learned to fear our own inner lives, to avoid the very introspection that might lead to growth and authenticity. The deep thinker, who naturally gravitates toward introspection and emotional complexity, finds themselves swimming against this cultural current. They're told they're overthinking when they're actually thinking clearly. They're accused of being too sensitive when they're responding appropriately to genuine stimuli. They're labeled as negative when they're simply refusing to participate in toxic positivity. This creates a kind of gaslighting effect, where the deep thinker begins to doubt their own perceptions and experiences. They start to wonder if they really are too much, too sensitive, too complicated. They begin to internalize the collective rejection of depth and question whether their way of being in the world is somehow wrong. The paradox of visibility. Here's a curious paradox that many deep thinkers experience. They simultaneously feel invisible and exposed. Invisible because their inner world, rich with complex thoughts, deep emotions, and nuanced understanding, remains largely unseen by others. Exposed because their sensitivity makes them vulnerable to every slight, every rejection, every moment of misunderstanding. This paradox creates a particular kind of psychological tension. The deep thinker longs to be seen and understood, to have their inner world acknowledged and appreciated. Yet they also fear the vulnerability that comes with true visibility. They've learned that showing their depth often leads to rejection, so they've developed sophisticated strategies for hiding in plain sight. The Greek concept of kenosis, a self-emptying or self-concealment, captures something of this experience. The deep thinker often empties themselves of their own needs and complexity in order to be more accessible to others. They become skilled at making themselves smaller, dimmer, less threatening. But this self-concealment comes at a cost. The deep thinker begins to lose touch with their own voice, their own needs, their own truth. They become so skilled at reading and responding to others that they forget how to listen to themselves. They become experts at emotional camouflage, blending into whatever environment they find themselves in. The irony is that this very adaptability, born from the need to survive in a world that doesn't understand them, often makes them even more invisible. They become chameleons, so skilled at becoming what others need them to be that they lose sight of who they actually are. This creates what we might call the authenticity trap. The deep thinker knows that authenticity is essential for meaningful connection, but they've learned that their authentic self is often too much for others to handle. So they find themselves caught between the rock of loneliness and the hard place of rejection. The solution, if there is one, lies not in becoming less authentic, but in becoming more discerning about where and with whom to share that authenticity. The deep thinker must learn to distinguish between environments that can hold their depth and those that cannot. They must learn to save their pearls for those who can appreciate their value. The wounded healer. Jung wrote extensively about the archetype of the wounded healer, the person who has been broken by life's challenges but transforms that brokenness into a source of healing for others. Many deep thinkers embody this archetype, carrying within themselves both profound wounds and profound wisdom. The deep thinker's wounds often come from a lifetime of feeling misunderstood, rejected, or too much for the world around them. They've been told to dim their light, to quiet their voice, to stop asking inconvenient questions. They've experienced the pain of authentic connection being met with discomfort or rejection. But these very wounds become sources of compassion and insight. The deep thinker who has felt the sting of rejection becomes skilled at creating safe spaces for others. The one who has been misunderstood becomes gifted at truly seeing and hearing others. The one who has been too much learns to hold space for others' intensity. This transformation from wounded to healer isn't automatic or easy. It requires what Jung called individuation, the process of integrating all aspects of the self, including the shadow parts we'd rather deny. The deep thinker must learn to embrace their sensitivity as a strength, their intensity as a gift, their depth as a treasure. But they must also learn to set boundaries, to protect their own well-being, to refuse to be drained by others' needs. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of the wounded healer's journey, learning to give without depleting themselves, to love without losing themselves. The deep thinker as wounded healer offers something unique to the world. They provide depth in a shallow culture, authenticity in a performative society, and genuine connection in an increasingly disconnected world. They serve as bridges between the conscious and unconscious, the spoken and unspoken, the felt and unfelt. The alchemy of solitude. Solitude and loneliness are often conflated, but they're fundamentally different experiences. Loneliness is the pain of feeling disconnected from others. Solitude is the joy of being connected to yourself. For the deep thinker, learning to distinguish between these states is crucial for psychological survival. The deep thinker often finds themselves alone, not by choice, but by circumstance. Their depth can intimidate others. Their intensity can overwhelm. Their questions can threaten. They may find themselves excluded from social circles, passed over for shallow connections, or simply misunderstood in groups. But within this enforced solitude lies a hidden gift. Away from the constant pressure to perform normalcy, the deep thinker can finally breathe. They can think their deep thoughts, feel their complex emotions, and explore their inner landscape without fear of judgment or rejection. Solitude becomes a sanctuary where the deep thinker can reconnect with their authentic self. It's where they can process the constant input they receive from the world. where they can untangle their own emotions from the ones they've absorbed from others, where they can remember who they are beneath all the masks and adaptations. The medieval mystics understood this well. They spoke of the dark night of the soul, a period of spiritual dryness and apparent abandonment that ultimately leads to deeper connection with the divine. For the deep thinker, periods of solitude and apparent isolation can serve a similar function, stripping away the superficial to reveal the essential. But this alchemical process requires intention and skill. The deep thinker must learn to transform loneliness into solitude, isolation into introspection, rejection into self-acceptance. They must learn to be good company to themselves, to find in their own depth the connection they seek from others. This doesn't mean becoming hermits or giving up on human connection. Rather, it means developing such a strong relationship with themselves that they can afford to be selective about their connections with others. When you're no longer desperate for acceptance, you can wait for genuine understanding. The frequency of finding. The question that haunts many deep thinkers is, where are my people? After years of feeling like aliens in their own culture, they wonder if there are others like them, others who think deeply, feel intensely, and question constantly. The good news is that these people exist. The challenging news is that finding them requires both patience and courage. Deep thinkers are drawn to certain environments and activities. They gravitate toward bookstores and libraries, art galleries and museums, coffee shops and quiet corners. They're attracted to philosophy and psychology, literature and poetry, spiritual practices and healing arts. They seek out documentaries over sitcoms, depth over entertainment, meaning over distraction. But even in these environments, deep thinkers often remain hidden. They've learned to camouflage their intensity, to moderate their depth, to test the waters before revealing their true selves. This means that finding other deep thinkers requires a kind of emotional sonar, the ability to sense depth beneath surface interactions. The signs are subtle but recognizable. It's the person who asks follow-up questions, who seems genuinely curious about your inner world, who isn't satisfied with surface-level answers. It's the one who references books you've never heard of, who notices things others miss, who seems to carry a certain weight of awareness. When two deep thinkers recognize each other, there's often an immediate sense of relief and recognition. Finally, someone who speaks the same language, who doesn't need things explained or simplified, who can match their intensity and depth. These connections, while rare, are profoundly nourishing. But deep thinkers must also learn to appreciate different types of relationships. Not everyone needs to be a soulmate or philosophical companion. Some relationships can be based on shared activities, others on mutual support, still others on simple companionship. The key is not expecting everyone to meet every need, but rather cultivating a network of relationships that, together, provide the richness and depth the deep thinker requires. The revolutionary act of authenticity. In a world that profits from our insecurity, being authentic becomes a revolutionary act. The deep thinker who refuses to dim their light, who asks uncomfortable questions, who insists on meaning over appearance, poses a threat to systems built on compliance and consumption. Consider how much of our economy depends on people feeling inadequate. The beauty industry thrives on insecurity about appearance. The self-help industry profits from our sense of inadequacy. The entertainment industry succeeds by keeping us distracted from our own lives. The deep thinker who has found peace with themselves, who values substance over style, who seeks meaning over entertainment, represents a challenge to these systems. This is why authentic deep thinkers often find themselves marginalized or labeled as difficult. They refuse to play the game that keeps everyone else distracted and compliant. They ask the questions that expose the emperor's nakedness. They feel the feelings that everyone else has learned to numb. But this refusal to conform isn't about being contrary or rebellious for its own sake. It's about integrity, the integration of inner truth with outer expression. The deep thinker cannot live a lie, cannot pretend to value what they don't value, cannot perform happiness when they feel sadness. This integrity is both their burden and their gift. It's a burden because it makes them aliens in their own culture, outsiders in their own society. But it's also a gift because it allows them to serve as witnesses to truth, as guardians of depth, as bridges between the conscious and unconscious. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote about the leap of faith, the decision to believe despite uncertainty. For the deep thinker, there's a similar leap required, the leap of authenticity, the decision to be themselves despite the risks, to speak their truth despite the consequences, to value depth despite the world's preference for surface. This leap requires tremendous courage. It means accepting that they may be misunderstood, rejected, or isolated. It means choosing truth over comfort, authenticity over acceptance, depth over ease. But it also means the possibility of genuine connection, meaningful work, and a life lived in alignment with their deepest values. The ripple effect. The deep thinker's influence extends far beyond their immediate circle. Like a stone thrown into still water, their authenticity creates ripples that spread outward in ways they may never fully see or understand. Their refusal to participate in collective unconsciousness gives others permission to wake up. Their commitment to depth creates space for others to explore their own inner worlds. This influence is often subtle and indirect. The deep thinker may never know that their willingness to ask difficult questions inspired someone else to examine their own assumptions. They may never realize that their emotional honesty gave someone else permission to feel their own feelings. They may never understand that their authenticity served as a beacon for others struggling to find their own way. But the ripples are real. Every time a deep thinker chooses authenticity over performance, truth over comfort, depth over surface, they contribute to a larger awakening. They help create a culture that values substance over style, meaning over distraction, consciousness over unconsciousness. This is the deep thinker's ultimate calling, not to be understood by everyone, but to remain true to their own depth. Not to fix the world, but to refuse to participate in its collective denial. Not to be loved by all, but to love themselves enough to stay authentic. The world needs deep thinkers now more than ever. In an age of artificial intelligence and virtual reality, we need people who can think deeply and feel authentically. In a time of increasing polarization and decreasing nuance, we need voices that can hold complexity and ambiguity. In a culture that values speed over depth, we need those who are willing to slow down and think carefully. The invitation. If you recognize yourself in these words, if you feel the familiar ache of being too much in a world that prefers less, then this is your invitation. An invitation to stop apologizing for your depth, to stop shrinking to make others comfortable, to stop pretending that shallow is enough. You are not broken, you are not too much, you are not the problem, you are awake in a world that prefers sleep. conscious in a society that chooses unconsciousness, authentic in a culture that rewards performance. Your sensitivity is not a weakness, it's your superpower. Your depth is not a burden, it's your gift. Your intensity is not a problem, it's your strength. The world needs what you have to offer, even if it doesn't always know how to receive it. The path forward isn't about becoming less of who you are. It's about becoming more skilled at being who you are. It's about learning to distinguish between environments that can hold your depth and those that cannot. It's about finding your tribe while still maintaining compassion for those who aren't part of it. It's about learning to love yourself so deeply that the world's rejection cannot touch your core. It's about developing such a strong relationship with your own authenticity that you can afford to be patient with others' unconsciousness. It's about becoming so rooted in your own truth that you can weather any storm of misunderstanding. The deep thinker's journey is not an easy one. It requires courage, resilience, and a willingness to walk alone when necessary. But it also offers rewards that those who stay on the surface will never know. The joy of authentic connection, the satisfaction of meaningful work, the peace of living in alignment with your deepest values. You are not alone in this. Scattered across the world are others like you, also questioning, also feeling, also seeking depth in a shallow world. Some you will find, others will find you. Trust that your authenticity is a beacon that will attract those who can appreciate its light. The world may seem to prefer illusion, but deep down, it's crying out for truth. It may seem to reward performance, but secretly, it's hungry for authenticity. It may seem to value surface, but its soul is starving for depth. You are the answer to that hunger. You are the light in the darkness. You are the depth in the shallows. You are the truth in the illusion. Don't dim your light to make others comfortable. Don't shrink your truth to fit their comfort zones. Don't apologize for being exactly who you are. The world needs your questions, your feelings, your depth, your truth. It needs your refusal to accept easy answers, your insistence on meaning, your commitment to authenticity. It needs your beautiful, complicated, intense, magnificent self. So be yourself, fully, completely, unapologetically. The world may not always understand, but it will be forever changed by your presence. And in the end, that's all any of us can do. Be who we are as deeply and authentically as possible, and trust that it's enough. Because it is. You are enough. You are more than enough. You are exactly what the world needs, even if it doesn't always know it. Welcome to the tribe of the awake. Welcome to the community of the conscious. Welcome to the fellowship of the deep. You are home.
Sooner you left, my heart's torn in two. Sooner you left, my night's cold and blue. Lovers fade, but none hurt like you. Rain on my soul, your shadow won't part. Rain on my soul, it drowns my